Hello, and welcome back to Raw Sports YouTube channel or Spotify or the podcast feed wherever you're listening. I am your head of sport, Josh Sim, and as the title suggests, this is a sort of special, sort of one-off episode we are doing to kind of look back at 2020. What a year of sport! What a year of what we initially thought was going to be non-sports, and then the sporting world kind of found a way to put some sporting action on. And so we're gonna have a bit of a look back over the next hour or so. This isn't gonna be too much of a long one. We're gonna look at the likes of coming up. We've got we're gonna look at cricket, we're gonna look at Formula One, we're gonna look at football and tennis quite soon. Actually, we'll start with ice hockey in a second. But comment down below. If you enjoyed this video, obviously like it, subscribe to the channel, all our social media in the video description to follow. It's been if I may, I might just indulge myself saying it's been a pretty decent year for the department. We've been fortunate to have a lot of guests on and interviewees as well, which is really exciting. You can just check them out on the channel and see all the podcast feed as well and see who we've talked to throughout the year, kind of recap, because it's been an unprecedented year, and obviously we've been fortunate with a lot of athletes and journalists and people in the media obviously working from home, and so it's made this whole experience a bit more, we've been able to get in touch with them, I guess, more, and made them more accessible than they would have been. So check those out. And before I ramble too on, we'll start this 2020 review. As I said, we're going to run through different sports. We will be bringing people in and out. This will be rotating them on, whatever sport they sort of want to talk about. So let's start with ice hockey. But before we do, and I'll bring on my guest because I do want to ask him this, and this is the Ball's sport editor, Luke James. Luke, how are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm not too bad. I just wanted, before we get into ice hockey, I just wanted to ask, because you and I, obviously, uniquely, we both run the sort of the student media, the sports departments, at least, of the student media societies on Warwick. And it's fair to say when you and I took over in March, there wasn't a lot to talk about sports-wise. And certainly, what was your, it must have been sort of a weird experience, because obviously you'd have planned out, obviously, what we thought was going to be a busy summer, then didn't. It was still busy, but not for the sports we thought was going to happen. And then as we kind of sit here now, obviously, the UK at least, areas of it's going into lockdown, and so fans are not going to be able to attend sports again. But it's been quite an experience, hasn't it, in terms of covering sports in 2020.
Yeah, it's been wild in general, and I think kind of as a case in point, I took over as kind of the Boar sport editor on, I think, the 12th of March, and then the whole of the country went into lockdown like a week later. And I think the first article I wrote kind of the day before I officially became editor was about how La Liga went into lockdown, Serie A went into lockdown. It was the day when lots of Juventus players tested positive for COVID-19 as well. And I kept updating the article throughout the day, because it was just like one thing fell, then another thing fell, then another thing fell. I was like, okay, this is going to be a really challenging year. But I think kind of the Boar and Draw have done such a, if we do say so ourselves, like a really good job of covering kind of what's been happening. And hopefully it will be a slightly more productive 2021 in terms of what we get to report on.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you and I, I'm sure, would have had plans at least on coverages of sports swimming before we wing it in the summer. Obviously, it hasn't panned out. Rather, it's been put on delay. But it's been a very interesting year nonetheless. And sort of, let's talk about ice hockey. First of all, it was the first American sport, we can say, that came back to life. Obviously, in a bubble environment, the NHL managed to organize it in pretty quick time. And I remember talking about this at the time of the Stanley Cup finals, which we'll obviously go on to in just a bit. But it remains a significant achievement that for the sport that they managed to kind of get organized and get themselves, in operational shape during this pandemic.
For sure. And I think the really important thing to remember about the NHL's kind of return to ice was that it all took place north of the border in Canada. So they had the two bubble cities in Toronto and Edmonton. And I think the NHL were, to a certain degree, quite pioneering in the sense that they were bold enough to say, look, the situation in the United States isn't good enough for us to return to the ice at the moment. They took it quite slow and steady in terms of the period of time they gave the players to get back up to speed. And then they implemented it, and I don't think they really had a case. And that was really impressive to see. And I think I'm slightly more interested in some of the East Coast teams. I follow the Maple Leafs mainly. And it was really great to see how all of the players were basically just trundling around BMO Field, which is where Toronto FC play their games in MLS. And it was quite interesting because basically the bit around BMO Field is just hotels, and it's kind of like the Olympic Village in Stratford. And it was just great to see lots of athletes just milling around. And as you say, it was a really good bubble environment, and they made a huge success of the NHL's return to play.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the end, certainly in North America, after a grueling sort of playoff series, we had, as we reported, Tampa Bay Lightning beating the Dallas Stars 4-2 in that series. Obviously, Tampa Bay, correct me if I'm wrong, they hadn't won the Stanley Cup in a while, in a few decades ago, I believe. So, we talked about it when the result first came up, and now looking back, this would have been this. I mean, this is a title that they will certainly remember for a long time in their history, given the circumstances and given that it's their second Stanley Cup as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the way in which the Lightning went about winning this trophy was really important because they kept lots of players that were very technical, and you see a lot of emphasis, especially on teams that struggle recently, on talking about how the general managers should go out and bring in lots of guys who are like very gritty and all this kind of stuff, and lots of the intangibles. The idea is that you bring in someone who basically roughs the other team up, and you have that kind of, in football terms, that kind of Stoke vibe about your team. And Tampa Bay just didn't go in that direction at all. They had lots of skill players, they had lots of technical players, and ultimately it really did pay off for them. And I think kind of the fact that they did go on to win the Stanley Cup is huge for them, because it is very much a sign that you can win in the NHL with a team that isn't full of lots of people who just want to kind of have a brawl every so often. So I think that was great to see. And across their roster, they've got lots of players who really did outperform their contract. And again, in order to be successful in any league that has a salary cap, you have to have players that exceed their contract value, because if they don't, then you're just going to be distinctly average. So I think kind of in terms of the product that they put on ice, and also how they went about building the organization, was really impressive. And I think it sets them up to be one of the best teams in the NHL going forwards.
Yeah, absolutely. And just kind of going through the awards of the season, obviously Victor Hedman obviously had a big year for the Lightning, won MVP of the playoffs. So the regular season, Leon Draisaitl, I hope I pronounced his name right, he won MVP for the regular season. Bruce Cassidy won best coach for the Boston Bruins. So those names mentioned, who stood out to you as having an outstanding sort of calendar year, at least 2020 season in the NHL?
I think there's lots of players that kind of deserve a shout out. The one I'd go for doesn't even play for the Lightning, to be honest. I always find Connor McDavid from the Edmonton Oilers really, really impressive. And he's someone who, the important thing to remember as well is the next Winter Olympics in a couple of years' time, the NHL has said, and this was part of the most recent kind of CBA agreement, was that the NHL players would be allowed to compete in the Winter Olympics. And I think Connor McDavid is going to be someone who's going to be so huge for Team Canada. And that's just going to be brilliant to see, because it'll be the first time in a while where you have all of the best players from the NHL representing their countries. And McDavid this year was playing on an Oilers team that, for me, isn't quite where it should be. They should be better than they are. And I think the fact that he is so talented, both on his own, but he also brings the level of his teammates up as well, is such an important thing to kind of take note of. I think in terms of like, if you wanted to go on the flip side and pick out someone who really underachieved, Freddie Anderson, who's the netminder for the Toronto Maple Leafs, had a really horrible year, both in the regular season and in the postseason. And I think a lot of people in Toronto were surprised that the Maple Leafs didn't go out and buy or trade for a new netminder. So that was something to take note of too. But I think the player for me is kind of, as I said, Conor McDavid is the best player in the NHL at the moment.
Yeah, and just before we switch gears to the European landscape of ice hockey, just to get your thoughts on, obviously the season, fingers crossed, will start on January 1st as sort of planned at the moment. What excites you heading into 2021 in terms of the NHL? What are you looking forward to?
To be honest, I'm just looking forward to the league coming back as a whole. I think, as you said, NHL made a huge success of the return to play, and I think that's something that is really a kind of, you can tip your hat to because they did such a great job, and I think that was really good to see. I think the team that I'm most intrigued by are actually the Toronto Maple Leafs, because they've made lots of really weird changes that you wouldn't ordinarily expect the Maple Leafs to do, and for the first time in a while, they've got a lot of players who are from kind of the Greater Ontario region. So like people like Joe Thornton, who's now 41 years old, is playing for the Toronto Maple Leafs. 30-year-old TJ Brody, 32-year-old Wayne Simmons. Lots of these people are kind of moving back to Canada, and that's not something you've seen for a while. And I think kind of as a whole, the thing that I'm most excited to see, this isn't confirmed yet, but it seems to be traveling in that direction, is that you could have an all-Canada division to kind of prevent cross-border play throughout the regular season, or limit cross-border play throughout the regular season. And I think that will be huge. And I think that will be most beneficial to the Toronto Maple Leafs, because if you compare kind of, and there was a really good article about this on The Athletic a couple of months ago, if you compare the quality of what an all-Canada division would be compared to kind of a shifted around metropolitan division, for example, where the Maple Leafs used to play or would ordinarily play, there's a kind of a huge difference between the bottom teams in Canada and the bottom teams in the metropolitan division. So that could really shake up the whole competition next year. You'll be seeing lots of kind of more fixtures between teams east and west coast of Canada, so that'll be exciting. But yeah, I think the NHL will do a good job coming back, and the interesting thing for me will be to see how they keep up this momentum. And there's still quite a lot of players who aren't signed to contracts, who are decent players and ordinarily would have been snapped up quite early in free agency. And the important thing from here is, because the salary cap is relatively fixed going forwards, organizations are going to have to be astute with how they spend their salary at this point. And I think we're going to see a more kind of austerity focused NHL, and that's not really something we've been familiar with, because the NHL has continued to grow over recent years. So going forwards, I think the All-Canada division could be really exciting. I think the Toronto Maple Leafs will either be brilliant or awful. I don't think there's much of an in-between with them. And as I say, Conor McDavid is just so good. Everyone needs to watch the Edmonton Oilers.
There we go. And some exciting stuff. And I mean, we should, mention the European ice hockey season, and specifically towards the UK. Obviously, the Cardiff Devils were at the time before in spring led the Elite Ice Hockey League in the UK. Obviously, then the season ended up being annulled, but Cardiff the Devils were awarded the league title. Any thoughts on? Any thoughts on the league, and how deserving were Cardiff to have won the title that season?
It's really interesting, the EIHL. To be honest, I follow British hockey more closely than I do anything kind of anywhere else. And Cardiff Devils are such an impressive organisation, and a lot of that goes down to their previous kind of general manager, Andrew Lord. He was brilliant. He was absolutely revered in Cardiff, and it's testament to the fact that they went on to essentially win the title in 2019-20. The thing that, and again, to look at the standings, so after 46 games, they had 64 points. If you're not aware, so you get 2 points for a win and 1 point for an overtime loss in ice hockey, or a penalty loss, that is. To get 64 points from 46 games is quite impressive. Next in the standings were the Sheffield Steelers, who are somewhat of a fallen giant. They should be better than they have been in recent years. They got 63 points. This really was shocking. So the Coventry Blaze ended up on 61 points from 48 games. And speaking from a tiny position of bias, I would say, Coventry was so impressive. And Coventry used to be really, really good. So back in the day, kind of in the mid-20s, in the 2010s kind of, and in the noughties, Coventry were one of the best teams in the league, but they just got overtaken by other organisations simply because they had more money, they had a bigger arena, this kind of stuff. And the team that Danny Stewart built last season was so exciting to watch, and it had this feel-good factor at the Skydome Arena that hadn't been there for such a long time. So for me, and they were on such a good run as well, I think since Christmas, so I think the 3 months before the season was ended, Coventry were the form team in the league. They only lost twice. I think one of those was against Cardiff and one of them was against the Belfast Giants. So yeah, Coventry was so good. And everyone in Coventry was really, really devastated that the playoffs didn't go ahead, because there was a genuine belief that this year might have been Coventry's year to kind of clamber back to the top of the standings. I think looking ahead perhaps to 2021, there could be a season still kind of following on from this one, but the players would be completely different. It would be a different standard. It would be much closer to kind of the NIHL than the EIHL. It'll be interesting to see, but British Ice Hockey was given money by the government as part of the winter funding package, so it still hangs in the balance. We could see a January return to play, and if so, that will be something really exciting to cover, because all of the teams will definitely be up for that.
Absolutely, and and wishing the Coventry side obviously the best in the league. Luke, we'll stick with you just a bit as we sort of wrap up ice hockey. Obviously, it's been a busy sort of year for tennis as well. Obviously, a lot harder to coordinate given sort of the scale of players traveling and all that kind of things. We obviously Wimbledon was lost this year, and we'll hopefully be back next year. But we did get quite a few we still got 3 of the 4 Grand Slams. Those I've just put on the screen, and for the audio people, these are we've just put up the rankings, the end of year rankings in terms of the singles for the men and women. In terms of, talking about the men, obviously the Australian Open, we had Djokovic took that title. He beat Dominic Thiem, who then went on to beat Alexander Zverev in the final of the US Open. And then in the French Open, Nadal then defeated Djokovic. And we see the top 5 there: Djokovic, Nadal, Thiem, Medvedev, and Federer. We sort of are seeing this kind of crop of next generation stars kind of coming out. And in this case, arguably the star of them was Dominic Thiem, who had a bit of a breakout season Grand Slam wise as well.
Yeah, Thiem was really impressive this year. And the thing is, we talk about him as being part of the next gen. He's, I think, kind of in his mid to late 20s at this point, and that's just kind of a testament to how good the people before him have obviously been. So he's 27 at the moment. He's born in September. And it speaks to how good Nadal, Djokovic, and Federer have been over the kind of past decades, and that's quite something to say. He was fantastic, especially at the end of tour event at the O2. Watching some of his performances was really impressive, and I think if you had to pick a single player looking into the next calendar year, he'd be the one that could potentially upset the likes of Federer, Nadal, and Djokovic. Dominic Thiem is just so impressive.
Yes, and we obviously saw Alex Zverev obviously made a Grand Slam final. Unfortunately, he didn't win it, but I'm sure there'll be many more to come in the future. But as you said, the likes of Djokovic and Nadal, obviously we didn't unfortunately get to see a lot of Federer due to injury issues. But certainly the aforementioned duo of the Serbian and the Spaniard, they continue again to prove that even age does not kind of stop their kind of dominance. And it does feel like in 2021 they will continue to kind of push on for those Grand Slams. Obviously, Australian Open's coming up very soon, but it does feel like, with sort of load management in terms of how many tournaments they do, those two are still primed for Grand Slam glory.
Yeah, definitely. I think you could pretty much nail on Nadal winning the French Open in particular. I think Djokovic stands a really good chance of winning the Australian Open. And again, I think this is one of the major concerns that people in tennis have had for quite a while, was the fact that it has been so predictable on the men's side. I think the women's side has been really hard to judge, especially since kind of Serena Williams has had a bit of a dip. It's so open on that side of the game. But on the men's side, it's just been the big 3. And I think they're all set up to do really well next year. And I think it's important not to underestimate I know he's kind of approaching the end of his career anyway, but it's really important that we don't underestimate a really well-rested Roger Federer, because he's had most of this year off, which I think will actually do him a world of good, given kind of how 2019 ended at Wimbledon for him. And there's just so much on the line, and all of them are looking to win the kind of quote-unquote GOAT race. So yeah, I think 2021 will be the final year of the big three. I think after that, Federer will probably retire. It'll be Nadal's twilight years too, and Djokovic also. So yeah, for one last hurrah, I think it would be brilliant to see really high competition this year, because that seems to be on the cards.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, we mentioned the next gen. Obviously, TM, you got Matteo Berrettini, I think is how you pronounce his name. Medvedev, obviously Zverev, as I mentioned. Stefano Tsitsipas, I think is how you pronounce his name. Obviously, a lot of next gen players as well coming through, which is obviously exciting. On the women's side, we had also some young stars come out. Arguably, the fourth ranked player, Sofia Kenin, had the best 2020 year of all the female tennis players. With I'll just quickly rattle off. She obviously won the Australian Open against Garbine Muguruza. Obviously, Naomi Osaka beat Azarenka in the final of the US Open, and then in the French Open, Kenin still made the final but lost to Swiatek, the Polish player. But as I said, and it's hard to argue, really, isn't it? Sofia Kenin probably had the best 2020 of all the female tennis players in the world.
Yeah, definitely. I think Kenin had a really good year. But that's the thing with women's tennis, is it has been so open and so unpredictable. And you see lots of these kind of what feel like really random kind of upsets in the major tournaments. And you look at some of the underlying form and the underlying numbers, and it's just so close. And I think that's what makes it so exciting, because you tune into a game and anyone can win. And with men's tennis, for a number of years, you haven't really had that impression. And the case in point on that is you look at kind of the draw, and you can basically map out who gets the what point and in which round Djokovic will play Nadal and this kind of stuff. And I think that's why women's tennis has been particularly exciting. I think the player that I'm most excited for kind of in 2021 would be Coco Gauff. She's outrageously talented for her age. She is really going to be a superstar, both for the stuff she does on the tennis court and off it as well. And I think that's something that can't go underlooked. And I think Naomi Osaka as well, and Ashley Barty will be in for very good years, because it's been a really tough year for all athletes from around the world. And I think 2021 will perhaps be a breath of fresh air, especially in tennis, because you'll be starting to see more and more fans return. And that's so important in tennis, because it's not like any other sport in that respect. You don't have fans who can go to your home matches. It is the world's game. And of course, it's been acutely impacted by the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. And, considering obviously Barty sat out for the majority of the second half of the season. And I mean, the other thing, you mentioned Coco Gauff, there's obviously an amazing crop of American tennis players coming through. And I know Naomi Osaka's part Japanese, part American, but Kenin, Gauff, obviously Sloane Stephens is out there as well. There's a great crop coming through. Let's talk about, obviously, you still have the likes of Serena Williams. Last I checked yesterday, she's ranked 11th in the world at the moment. Do we expect much of her much success for her in 2021? Is this sort of, maybe are we seeing sort of a passing of the torch kind of moments? Where are we with that at the moment?
In women's tennis, I honestly think the torch had been passed quite a while ago. I think the issue that Serena Williams has at the moment is that she's kind of stuck in her own head at this point. I mean, she's had a couple of opportunities since coming back from maternity leave to win these championships, and she's essentially fluffed her lines. And there's been a couple of examples where she's got really frustrated about that. And that's fine. I mean, athletes get frustrated. And to be honest, I quite like that. I like an athlete who... one of my favorite athletes is Andy Murray, and that's kind of somewhat because he just berates himself throughout tennis matches. I think it's quite funny, and I like that he's fired up in that way. And I think Serena Williams, if she is going to win another Grand Slam, and of course she's chasing Margaret Court's record in that regard, I think she just needs to go back to basics, and that's so easy to say as someone who can't hit a tennis ball as well as Serena Williams. But there just needs to be this realization that she is in the final years of her career, and she needs to approach things slightly differently. And again, Serena Williams is such a powerful player. She pulls off these shots, and a lot of the time she's playing against top-class opposition, and they just look at the ball go by, and they're like, yeah, I was never going to get that. That was so good. She's evidently got the talent. She's got the class. It's whether or not she can find her form in 2021. I suspect if she doesn't find her form in 2021, it could be her final year on tour.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to get your just on your final question. I just wanted to ask you. Obviously, next year we have the delayed Olympics, obviously coming in, and in tennis, obviously there is significance on that. On players will go and at times go and sacrifice some of their season to go out there and go get the gold medal. And often the Olympics is sort of put in between Wimbledon and the US Open in a kind of an awkward position in which players who make a deep run in Wimbledon may be too tired to then go for the Olympics and US Open. Do you foresee sort of these issues kind of cropping up and this dilemma maybe becoming something players will have to consider in 2021?
Yeah, definitely. And that's the interesting thing as well, because thinking back to London 2012 as well, Andy Murray was so fired up to win kind of the Olympics at Wimbledon that it became such a spectacle. And I think tennis is unlike lots of other sports that also feature at the Olympics, because it is really something that is important to these players. And correct me if I'm wrong, Nadal hasn't won an Olympic title yet, I don't think. I'm not too sure. But there are a number of players who really want to win this title. And again, it's of course Roger Federer's final Olympics if he chooses to go. It's going to be on a hard court surface in Tokyo, which obviously lends itself to Novak Djokovic if he does attend the Olympics. And I just think there is so much on the line for all of these players that it will be such an interesting tournament. It's going to take place between the 24th of July and the 1st of August next year. And again, there's a lot of things that could happen between now and then. So in terms of player management, we've already seen that people like Roger Federer are really good at this. Roger Federer knows when to sit out a tournament. So the question will be for someone like Novak Djokovic in particular is, will he be willing to sit out one of the Grand Slams to give him a better chance of winning Tokyo 2020? Personally, I doubt it, but who knows?
Yeah, and I'll just quickly say that Nadal did win in 2008 the gold medal. 2012, 2016, Andy Murray won it twice in a row. So you wonder if he'd want to go for a hat trick of gold medals. And on the women's side, Serena won in 2012, but a lot of it's been one of those tournaments that's kind of changed hands. You got Elena Dementieva won it in 2008, and in 2016 it was Monica Puig of Puerto Rico. So again, a dilemma for the women's players as well, whether they want to go and chase Olympic glory as well. So it should be a really interesting year, 2021. And Luke, thank you very much. We will bring you back in just a bit to talk about some of the other sports in just a bit. We will, before we move on to cricket, I should also just give a shout out to, we talked a bit about American sports, so give a shout out to obviously the NBA, which I follow a lot. Congratulations to the LA Lakers who won their title after, again, also adopting the bubble approach. Like the NHL, the Lakers eventually emerged victorious in the playoffs against the Miami Heat, the unfancied Miami Heat, I should say, to make the finals. So big year for them. Obviously, LeBron James had a very successful summer, and it again will be interesting to see if they can back it up in 2021. Obviously, they also have the Olympics as well, which is going to be interesting to see how many players commit themselves to the Olympics in the middle of the basketball, or towards the end of at the business end of the basketball season. So, but yeah, excited. And for those who are listening, watching, want to name for 2021 in terms of basketball, I mean, Luka Doncic had an amazing 2020. Don't be surprised if he solidifies himself as I don't want to compare him to Steph Curry, but certainly in that sort of popularity figure. Don't be surprised if he cements himself up there as well. But we will shift gears and we'll move on to cricket. And to do that, I will bring on Cam Hall to join me to talk about the year for cricket. So here's Cam. Cam, how are you?
I'm doing very well. Great to be on.
No worries. So let's talk about cricket, and specifically sort of the notes I've put together. And I'll ask if any other cricket kind of took your eye. But I've got sort of the notes on the England cricket team and their record for 2020. Let's talk about the Test series. They only managed to have 2 Test series this year, obviously in a very confusing, obviously, calendar year for cricket, for all sports as well as cricket. But it defeated the West Indies and Pakistan. And I think the big thing is obviously some new batsmen kind of really have now stake to claim in this team. I'm talking about the likes of Ollie Pope and Zach Crawley. What did you make of the England test team, at least in 2020, and what are you hoping for in 2021?
Well, I think the first thing to say is credit firstly to the England Cricket Board, Cricket West Indies, and Pakistan Cricket Board for putting together the biosecure bubbles that we had for the two series that we had in the summer. I think it was also as well to Cricket Australia for the limited over series as well. I think all of the work that they did to make sure that was as safe as possible and enforced as stringently to allow cricket to go on as safely as possible. I think that definitely has to be commended. But yeah, England's test team, they've seemed to have started to plug now a lot of the gaps that we've had since that ill-fated Ashes tour down under 2013-14, where the team just sort of imploded in on itself. And, we lost Trott, we lost Peterson, Ian Bell fell out of favour. England have really had to fill those gaps, and I think they've started to move towards that now. I think in Rory Burns and Dominic Sibley, I think we have now a more stable opening partnership that we haven't had since Strauss and Cook. Dom Sibley, I think in particular, has had a fantastic summer. I think there is, quite valid concern with his scoring rate. He's not the fastest batsman in the world, but for someone who provides that stability in the top order, we've been saying for so long that the test team is almost, whilst the one-day team has, become the best in the world, and almost out of nowhere because England and the players have been allowed to play this more aggressive style of cricket that suits the likes of Ben Stokes, Josh Buttler, the test team was going with that, and England just couldn't build that sort of stability that they needed. Dom Sibley, I think, coming in at the top of the order has really done a good job, and Zach Crawley as well in bringing that stability. I mean, Zach Crawley was interesting because he wasn't in the team at the start of the summer. His first-class average isn't impressive. It's only 35, but he's technically a very good batsman. And that number 3 spot that England have had has been one that they've been really struggling to fill now for some time. Because England have tried all sorts of options. They've tried Gary Ballance, who is, again, a good batsman, but an LBW waiting to happen. You've got James Vince, again, technically one of the best batsmen. I've seen him play many times, a very technically good batsman. But again, always, waiting to just nick to slip, trying to play a cover drive. You've got Johnny Bairstow as well. They've tried at number 3, who, again, fantastic opening up for the one-day team, but always does leave his stumps on show too much. He is, again, a bowl out waiting to happen. So Zach Crawley is just giving England. He's very technical. Yes, he's very elegant when he plays, but he's also very stable. I think his knock in Southampton against Pakistan at 267, what was really impressive about that was not just the fact he was scoring at a good rate, but he knew what balls to leave, what balls to play. And that number 3 spot, I think the opener spot's been a problem that England have for some time, but they've won regardless because of that middle order, Joe Root, Ben Stokes, Josh Buttler. Obviously, Joe Root's form hasn't been great recently, but Stokes and Buttler have had fantastic summers, even despite, in Ben Stokes' case, quite the personal difficulties he's had this year. But Zach Crawley, I think, has really given that England that stability at number 3. And going forward, England have such a young team now. I think if the one-day team kind of solidified past the old guard, and the old guard, I talk about not just, Cook, Bell, Peterson, but I'd also include Jimmy Anderson and Stuart Broad, I think both of whom, fundamentally still have their places in the test team. But, the one-day team moved on from that, and look how that has done for them if you keep Anderson and Broad just in test match cricket. But they've really started, I think, England to have this younger generation of players coming through who are technically very good. But I think what's really good is that they are getting proper test match specialists playing in the test matches now. Ollie Pope, Zach Crawley, Rory Burns, Dom Sibley, I don't think you would want in a limited overs team, but you could feasibly play the other 3 in your limited overs side. But I think England know where to play to their strength. I think it speaks to the depth that they've got, not just in their batting, where you have some of the best batsmen in the world in Jason Roy, Johnny Bairstow in limited overs cricket. You don't want to be playing those players in test match cricket. Their style is much more suited to that limited overs. So the depth is there. It's a young team. And yeah, it's going to take time to solidify. And England have some big tests coming up. They've got a difficult tour to India, where I think a lot of the frailties that England players have to spin is going to be really on show. And we saw Dom Sibley in particular was not at all comfortable against spin over the summer. And then, of course, the tour to Australia in the Ashes next winter, which is going to be a completely different beast. You're going to need to be able to play the short ball. And, you know, Cummins, Hazelwood, Stark, they are quick bowlers who are going to be firing 90-mile-an-hour deliveries at you almost from the minute the first ball is bowled at the Gabba. So I think it's two real tests coming up for these players now. But certainly, I think it's one that they can meet, definitely.
Yeah, and that tour to India obviously recently announced, obviously, so a 2-test tour of Sri Lanka as well, I believe, is a sort of a warm-up series next month as well. So, I mean, before we look at those tours, I mean, we should mention, obviously, in the limited over series in T20, they beat Australia and South Africa in the series. So the South Africa one cut short because of coronavirus concerns there, and drew at Pakistan, and then lost to Australia in the one-day series. Obviously, not really major sample size, but still plenty of reasons of optimism, as you mentioned, with the limited overs teams as well.
Yeah, I mean, the one-day team I don't think is going to be too much of a concern in the immediate future, because we won the World Cup in 2019. The next World Cup's not till 2023. We've got plenty of time to be preparing for that World Cup. I think the only thing I would say is that I do think it is going to be in India, and with the T20 World Cup in India as well next year, I do think England need to do a bit more to bring in some spinners. I mean, Adil Rashid and Moeen Ali, two fantastic players in limited overs, but we've seen with Moeen Ali in particular recently, he hasn't been there in terms of his form. His form is not, he's not the player he was, you know, even 2 or 3 years ago. So I think England do need to try and find some other options there. But certainly, I think with that T20 side, I mean, there's a lot of fantastic players who've really come forward. Davin Milan has been fantastic. I think really justifying his spot. I think he's someone who, you know, has always had flashes of potential, but hasn't really had that chance to solidify himself in the limited overs side. And of course, he had that chance in the test team where he famously got dropped because he was told that he is more suited to playing away from home, which I don't think really wasn't really a glowing compliment for him. But, you know, he's shown himself now to be, I think he is, if not the best, the second or third best T20 player in the world. He just has that ability to just get going very quickly, but do it in a way that, again, is not reckless. You know, he's not going to be hitting sixes from the first ball, but it's going to be a good quick start, but also controlled, and he's going to get you those runs. And vitally, that platform for, you know, a lot of the big hitters that England have down the lower order as well to come in.
Yeah, absolutely. And just, you know, looking at their schedule, obviously scheduled to be after at least this winter, obviously Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and India all coming to England to play various forms of cricket. You mentioned the 2020 World Cup and the Ashes as well, kind of headlining that winter as well. So a busy year projected for England. Just to kind of wrap up, what are your hopes and expectations for this team going forward for 2021?
I think it's going to be I think it's a good year. I think England have the players now, and they have more solidity, and they've got so much depth. I think the really difficult thing England are going to have is selection, and I think particularly looking at the sort of teams that England are going to be playing, I think when they're going to India, obviously the spin attack is going to be crucial there. And, you know, in Dom Bess, Moeen Ali, obviously very good spinners, but they're not at the level they used to be. Jack Leach, again, a good spinner. All three of them can do it, but they are not of the level of a Ravichandran Ashwin or a Ravindra Jadeja. They are going, I think, to have a difficult series in India. I think England will get tested. I don't expect England to win that. I do expect them to lose it. But I expect England to play well. I expect them to maybe win a test. I expect them to put India under pressure. But I think we've got to be realistic about how they're going to do in India. Sri Lanka is a possible win. We won in Sri Lanka last time. They don't have the leadership and the skill of Kumar Sangakkara or Mahela Jayawardene there anymore in that team. Again, the summer, obviously, we've got India coming over to England in the summer. This is a series England should be able to win. I think a lot of it depends. We've seen it on pitches, how England prepare the pitches. We know India really don't like swing. But at the same time, I don't know if England will want to be preparing loads of pitches with swing, knowing they're going to go to Australia where the pitches will be flat, they will be fast, they'll be bouncy. And I think for England, something they are really going to have to nail down is their pace attack. And the fact is, England have reasonably 6 or 7 frontline bowlers that they can be using. And if you to sort of put a team together for the Ashes at the moment, say you have Rory Burns and Dom Sibley opening, you've then got Zach Crawley at 3, Joe Root at 4, Ollie Pope, Ben Stokes and Joss Buttler. That leaves you 4 bowlers. You're going to need to have a spinner down under for if the pitches start cracking. Don Bess is probably your best option, or Jack Leach if he can put himself forward more as a better spinner than Don Bess, simply because Don Bess also has some runs in him as well. Then you've got three bowling options. You know, Stuart Broad, Jimmy Anderson, Jofra Archer. You've got Sam Curran, Chris Wokes, Ollie Stone as well. I mean, who do you leave out of that side? It's a real test for England, because I think the fact is they've got bowlers who bring a very different skill set. You know, obviously Stuart Broad has really started to develop into a very good frontline bowler now, similar to obviously Jimmy Anderson brings a lot of swing, which may not be useful in Australia, but certainly think of the Adelaide Test as a day-night test, swing will be useful there. Stuart Broad is someone who can really lead that attack. Now, he's had arguably one of the best summers of his career, nominated for Sports Personality. And I think getting dropped from that first test, I think it was the motivation, because I think Stuart Broad's form, people have questioned it the last few years. I know he's not been the player he was 2013, 2014, 2015, where he was world beating, but he started to move towards that again. I think getting dropped may be one of the best things for him. But then you're looking down the team, you've got the pace of Jofra Archer and Mark Wood. I think 2 players who England have gone for many times. They know that they've got those quick balls within them, but they know they're both quite they're injury concerns as well. They need them fit for Australia. They need them to both be playing. But then can you play both of them? You know, Sam Curran is a swing bowler. He's not the fastest, but he's a good left arm. A left armer is always, you know, a very bit of a jewel because it's very unpredictable, but he's also a swing bowler. Will that go well in Australia? But of course he can bat as well. Chris Wokes, again, a very good all-rounder. We saw it in that win against Pakistan, just both how good his bowling was, but how he can get England, you know, out of the hole they are in to get them across line. I mean, that's the dilemma England have got, where perhaps they don't have it with the one-day team or the limited overside, where they know this. I think England know their best 11 in both of those games, whereas for the test side, particularly where as far as the bowlers are concerned in that bowling attack, they don't know their best 11 at the moment. And I think that's going to be crucial for them to find, because if you go to Australia and you don't have a batting attack that can, you know, cut up with Cummins, Hazelwood, and start coming at you 90-mile-an-hour balls, Nathan Lyon bowling his crafty bit of spin, and then a bowling attack that can, you know, play Smith, David Warner, Marnus Labuschagne, who has really, I think, been my standout player of the last 12 months. I think that it's going to be a really difficult series for England if they can't knuckle down that bowling attack that they're going to use, and use well per venue, per pitch.
Well, there's certainly a whole lot of cricket next year to look forward to and see, and sort of firm up the selections, at least by the time we get around to the Ashes. I can't pretend as an Australian that I'm rooting for England in the Ashes, so I wish England the best of luck up until that stage, and then unfortunately my support drops off. But Cam, obviously, you know, great to hear from you talking about the cricket. Obviously, we will check in with you in just a bit, but thank you for that. A quick reminder as well, you can follow Raw Sports social medias here at the following. On Twitter, we are at Raw1251 underscore sports. On Instagram, we are at Raw1251 sports. Yes, I just wanted to give another quick shout to another American sport. Obviously, American football. The Kansas City Chiefs won the Super Bowl in February, which feels like a long time ago, but they did beat the 49ers in quite an amazing fourth quarter comeback led by Patrick Mahomes, who is arguably taken 2020 by storm and has become the face of the sport. Obviously got that massive 10-year contract as well, one of the highest paid athletes in America. I guess the other major story the NFL will obviously have 2020 to remember for is the year Tom Brady and the New England Patriots divorced and broke up. And Tom Brady now obviously at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers towards the twilight of his career. It'll be very interesting to see. Obviously the season's still underway, coming up to the playoffs soon. So it'll be very interesting to see where he takes the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. But again, 2020 being the divorce year, I guess, of Brady and the Patriots, and with Bill Belichick as well. And I should mention as we talk about F1, we talk about sports documentaries that have really taken a life of its own in 2020. The Last Dance is with Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls being profiled. That was a cultural storm in the US. And in a moment, as we talk about F1, Drive to Survive as well, I feel like found a real home in 2020, with resonating with kind of audiences, F1 fans around the world, as well during lockdown. And there's been a lot of fascinating sports shows as well. But let's talk about Formula One, and I'll be interested to hear what kind of everyone thinks about the significance of Drive to Survive. So joining me to talk about Formula One, we have Ben Parkinson, Sport Deputy. We also have Luke James returns, as does Cam Hall. So all of us here to talk about Formula One. Guys, I mean, as I alluded to just then, and maybe I'll start with Luke on this one. Drive to Survive has been a massive success for the sport, hasn't it? In terms of marketing and in terms of bringing in new fans. It's done everything that I'm sure Chase Carey and Liberty Media hoped it would do in terms of bringing interest to the sport.
Definitely. It's been a roaring success. And I think part of the reason for that is that Formula One is one of few sports where the drivers are able to have a personality and it be part of the appeal. So a lot of the time with things like football, you have players who are kind of berated for having that personal touch and the things that kind of make them unique. But in F1, you have people who are followed as a result of their personality. And I think that fits really well in terms of making a documentary series, because people watch it to watch the person they like to see drive. And I think that's a huge reason behind the success. And I think, the season we've just had, of course, the new series will come out kind of next year, is just going to be so interesting because so much has happened this year, and it'll be really fascinating to see how they cover kind of being in the bubble, how that impacted the drivers and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think of all of the documentary series we've seen, obviously things like Leeds United, Manchester City, kind of all this stuff, I think Drive to Survive is probably the highest quality one. And I think it's the least embellished one, especially when you compare it with, as you said, kind of The Last Dance, which was heavily criticized by people who aren't called Michael Jordan. So yeah, I think Drive to Survive was really, really good.
Yeah, obviously there was also All or Nothing Tottenham Hotspur, which obviously has won Jose Mourinho new fans maybe on the internet and on social media. Ben, what do you reckon about Drive to Survive and how significant it's been in terms of amongst its sports documentary peers in terms of bringing interest to the sport and interest into this season as well, which we'll talk about in just a bit?
Yeah, no, I think it's been massively significant. I think what it allows you is that insight into Formula One, because, if we're honest, it's not the most accessible sport in terms of actually going there. It's in various different countries, so it requires a lot of traveling. So, if you've only ever been to Silverstone, which is the obviously British Grand Prix, then, you're not able to go there and see what it's like. And even then as well, from a spectator's point of view, it's very different than actually being there and being within a race team and seeing how it all operates. So I think in terms of that, it's great for the audience to see the inside view of what it's like there, because at the same time, it's not it's a sport that I think is growing, and especially across genders, I think as well. I think you're seeing more females become involved in the engineering and become involved in also the actual driving as well in GP2 and GP3. So that's great to see. So I think a documentary as well allows that to sort of be reached by everyone. So I think that it's great in terms of that point of view for Formula One, and hopefully it will continue to grow, because like Luke said, it'll be fantastic to see this season.
Yeah, and Cam, before we go into sort of the results of this season, the fact that we have a 17 race F1 season to look back on in 2020 feels like a remarkable achievement. And I know for those who watch or listen, obviously we'll have a bit more of a deep dive on the channel you can look at on the YouTube channel or the Spotify or the podcast feed. That'll be there hopefully by the time this comes out. But the fact that we have a 2017 race season that did globe trek, obviously not globe trek to the extent that it normally does, but it's quite remarkable that we managed to get a season up, isn't it?
No, I mean, absolutely. And again, credit to the FIA, to FOM for putting together such a fantastic season and, getting all of these races together. And again, the biosecure bubbles. I mean, of course, obviously we saw with the cases of Sergio Perez, Lance Stroll, Lewis Hamilton catching COVID, they weren't, of course, entirely always there, but keeping people as safe as possible and allowing, what I think Ben put right, F1 is very much a global traveling circus. It was probably going to be the hardest thing to put together, yet it seemed one of the most seamless sporting bubbles that was put together all year. I think in particular, we talk about the 17 race calendar. I think we have to give credit to the tracks that we haven't seen in Formula One for many years, or indeed making their debuts, that came onto the season to fill the void this year. Mugello, Nürburgring, Portimao, Imola. I mean, in many Istanbul Park as well. I mean, in many of those cases, I think I would say those 5 races were, I think, amongst the best all year. Perhaps it was the drivers not knowing the circuits that well and really putting on a level playing field. But some of those races, I think, just for the drama and just, I think, for the fantastic racing, I think you saw as well. Having these tracks come onto the calendar, and I think it gave F1 a real wake-up call. So I think something I discussed previously on the show, on the F1 weekly shows, was the direction that Formula One wanted to be going in. Did it want to go back to these historic tracks that, people want to go back to history, or are we going towards this new destination race, more street circuit kind of model? And I think having some of these circuits come back onto the calendar, I think really revived people's interest in these more traditional, old school style circuits, because I think having seen these 5 tracks come onto the calendar this season, it's very difficult, I think, for me not to imagine them being on the calendar next season. We know that there is one spare race spot for 2022. From what I heard on Sunday, David Croft was saying that he has heard it is likely to be Portimao getting that spot. I think the consensus was it will be either Portimao or Istanbul Park. But I think the fact that you can't have both of them on the calendar, I think it says a lot, really, just about how much demand there is for Formula One, how many places you can go to in the world. And I think perhaps something to consider for the future, maybe a rotational model where you keep a few key circuits on the calendar, the key ones like Silverstone, Spa, Monaco, where the history is, where you get the best racing, but then maybe rotate some of the others. I think credit to everyone for putting together this season, but I think it's really shown just how much demand there is for races across the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, again, as you said, a lot of sort of new tracks of 2020, maybe not new tracks to the sport, obviously returned, and we got some amazing races out of them. And I mean, talking about the driver standings, and Luke, there's only one man dominated this year, as he has done over recent years, and that's Lewis Hamilton, obviously. We talk about him, we've kind of put him in that sort of pantheon with the likes of Mansell and Stirling Moss in terms of great British drivers. And this year, arguably this championship obviously, has put him on near, if not higher than Michael Schumacher, where it was just another fantastic year, wasn't it, for him? And now his status in the sport is surely up in the top 2, maybe even the top driver of the sport, up there, at least in that conversation.
Lewis Hamilton is the best Formula One driver of all time, for me anyway. And I say that as someone who, until this season, was very adamant that no one would ever, in my heart, overtake kind of Michael Schumacher, because I grew up watching him. But what Lewis Hamilton has achieved is frankly ridiculous. And again, people will bang on about, it's just the car, you could put my nan in the car and she'd drive really fast, all this kind of nonsense. But Lewis Hamilton has been so consistent, and even at the last Grand Prix of the season, when he clearly wasn't kind of up to his best, kind of recovering from the coronavirus, he still finished 3rd. I mean, you can't really knock it. And I just honestly believe that if you look at all the statistics, kind of race wins, pole positions, all this kind of stuff, Lewis Hamilton just comes out on top. And he's still got plenty left in the tank. I mean, next year, again, the regulations are remaining the same, which clearly lends itself to another kind of season of Mercedes dominance. So there's not really much to say about Hamilton because he is just so good. He is so hard to pick faults in. And the only thing I would say is that he probably shouldn't have raced at the last Grand Prix of the season. If he wasn't entirely up to it, should have let Russell race. Would have been interesting to see. But yeah, I mean, it's perfect seasons don't really happen in sport, especially in a year like 2020 when the world got turned upside down. But Lewis Hamilton had a season that was very, very close to being perfect. And I think for that, he should win Sports Personality of the Year for sure. And he should also be recognised as probably the greatest kind of British sports person of all time.
Yeah, it's hard to, I mean, he had 11 race wins out of 17, which is just staggering. And it's quite remarkable. And he never seemed to let up in terms of his racecraft and speed. But Ben, I mean, arguably the other sort of big thing that kind of came out this season was the emergence of this next generation class, the likes of George Russell, as Luke has alluded to. Lando Norris had a very good season. Obviously, Charles Leclerc continued on fine work he's been doing. Max Verstappen had a very good season. It does feel like now, and maybe Drive to Survive is helping, but it does feel like there is this class of drivers that we are now kind of growing up with and can possibly lead the sport going further into the future as well.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think it's just very exciting for Formula One at this moment in time. It'll be really interesting to see next year with Fernando Alonso returning, because it will almost be Alonso, Vettel and Hamilton as the kind of veterans there. And then you have up against the likes of Verstappen, Russell and Leclerc. And Norris obviously involved as well. So yeah, I think it's really, really good for Formula One and progressive. It's interesting to follow Lewis Hamilton's pathway, because you think back to even when he won his first championship with McLaren, and before then, he was a fantastic driver, had so much potential, but often, used to make some sort of silly mistakes in his racing. And for example, he just want to go fast all the time. He'd wear the tires out and then end up losing the race. And then you've now seen Lewis Hamilton really kind of mature as a driver. Every time he's on that track, he really takes control, and knows what he's doing. He's sensible, and that's really why he's again, in my opinion as well, the greatest Formula One driver of all time. So it will be interesting to see how these young boys develop as drivers, because there's a lot of talent there, and it only means bright things for the future of Formula One, and especially, like you said, alongside the documentary, being able to show us all the inside of that as well.
Yeah, and as you said, there's obviously drivers, they are chasing that ghost of Hamilton. Obviously, it'll be a long way. They have a long way to go, but if Hamilton's doing it at this age, there's no stopping what these guys can do. And obviously, the constructors wise, it wasn't that competitive at the top end, it's fair to say. Obviously, Red Bull, and I'm sure we'll talk about it at some point, Red Bull's win at Abu Dhabi, maybe that gives them hope of what they can do in 2021 with the not hugely changed regulations. And arguably as well, you had and when we look at McLaren, Racing Point, Renault, and to a certain extent Ferrari and AlphaTauri at times, we had a really competitive midfield battle, and certainly it bodes well for next season if we have teams being able to interchange almost at every Grand Prix, maybe due to a car's strengths and certain tracks or something like that. But it's quite exciting to have those teams kind of in and around each other.
Oh no, definitely. I mean, the first thing to say, really looking at the Constructors' Championship, is that if Lewis Hamilton was a single constructor on his own, he would have still topped the Constructors' Championship. I mean, I think to follow on from what Luke was saying earlier, undoubtedly the greatest British driver of all time, amongst the greats of Formula One, arguably better than Schumacher. I would say he only finds himself rivaling, perhaps just edging out Jim Clark and rivaling Ayrton Senna, in my personal opinion. But I think on the point of the midfield, I mean, it was fantastic. I think yes, Mercedes were so far out in front, but I think Ferrari's loss of form this season, was perhaps a catalyst for I think a lot of these midfield teams to come forward and really stake their claim. And for a lot of these younger drivers, we say younger drivers, obviously Sergio Perez has been in the sport for 10 years, but drivers who have been sort of within that midfield for some time, or just coming into the sport to really show what they can do. And as I think Luke and Ben have really touched on all of the drivers that have emerged this season. And yeah, it's been really good to see. I think it's been good to see where the future of Formula One's going. It's been good to see people taking these opportunities when they have it. I think McLaren deserved to come third. I think they were the most consistent out of those teams throughout the season. Their results may not have been the most spectacular. They got a couple of podiums here and there, but they were the most consistent on most tracks. And Carlos Sainz, I think once his bad luck with mechanical issues at the start of the season stopped, really started to get those consistent top 5 finishes. Lando Norris really doing that at the start of the season. So that's why I would say I think they deserved it there. I think Racing Point, I think there will always be the controversy over the copycat Mercedes. I think next season, obviously going over to Aston Martin, I think there's a lot of optimism in having Sebastian Vettel, who may not have the best season this time around, but I think in a team where, yes, obviously Lance Stroll is the son of the owner, but I think there is a lot of optimism that he can bring the team around him and lead it to much greater success. Yeah, I mean, AlphaTauri as well, I think, were another team as well we've not mentioned, but I think really came on this season. Pierre Gasly, and towards the end of the season as well, Danny Kvyat. Both drivers, I think, really performed at a high level. I think it'll be interesting to see what goes on and with the second Red Bull seat. I guess that's where everything ends, really, because Red Bull have a car that's not great with balance. Verstappen's obviously very good at getting that under control and really being able to challenge the Mercedes. Alex Albon, not so much. I think if Red Bull want to challenge for the Constructors' Championship, they need to put someone like a Sergio Perez in the car. Alex Albon, I think, had a very good weekend in Abu Dhabi. I would say his best weekend of the season. Now, a lot of people are saying, oh, Mercedes turned down the MG UKs in their engine, so the cars weren't performing as well. But nonetheless, Albon, I think, drove very consistently, staying around the top 4. And, easily could have got a podium at the end with a couple more laps. But he's not been consistent throughout the season. It's very much peaks and troughs. And Sergio Perez has just come off the back of the best season of his career. Despite arguably quite a difficult start for Perez, since he had coronavirus, since sort of Belgium and Monza, he has just been relentless in consistently he's picked up points in every race that he started this season, apart from that final race where he retired. He's, got his first win in Formula One last time out. He's had a couple of podiums as well. So they have to, I mean, a lot of it depends on that change, and Red Bull need to make that change. Otherwise, they just won't have that consistency that can take on Mercedes. I mean, Mercedes will still be the fastest team next year. But if with Perez in that second Red Bull, it gives them more of an ability to challenge at the front, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, we'll do a bit more, but we will, by now at least, by the time this comes out, we would have done more of a deep dive into the F1 season and 2021. But just quickly, before we kind of switch gears towards football, one thing you guys are excited about for 2021, if I go around the horn, in terms of whether it's a driver change, obviously there's been a fair few in terms of certainly significant ones as well, whether it's a new track, or what is it that you guys are excited about? For one thing that you guys are most excited about for 2021, I'll start with Ben and we'll go around the sort of circle. So Ben?
I'm most excited to see Daniel Ricciardo in a McLaren. I think it's a really interesting move. I think it's good for both parties. So I think it'll be interesting to see what happens there.
Yeah. Luke?
Mick Schumacher. Just because the nostalgia factor is obviously there, but I think he's a brilliant driver in his own right, and he's obviously going to be the more popular of the two Haas drivers for next season as well. I just think it's set up for very much to have a Mick Schumacher roadshow next year at Haas, and I think that's going to be really exciting to see, because he performed really well in F2 this year, kind of beating a lot to the title as well. And again, it's just interesting to see new drivers onto the grid. I'd caveat that by saying that it's criminal that Sergio Perez doesn't have a drive for next season, but that's kind of a topic for another day.
Yeah, absolutely. Two exciting driving changes. And Cam, finally, what one thing you're excited about for next year?
Going to McLaren, it's a win-win situation, as Ben said. Danny Rick needs a car, and I think the ability to just go back towards the front of the grid. He's one of the quickest drivers. He's someone who, can pull off these daring overtakes. and I think Renault just didn't give him the car like he hoped for. I think McLaren, they're on an upward trajectory with Mercedes engines as well next season. I think, I'm going to go for the same as Ben as well. I think Danny Rick to McLaren, I think that is very, very exciting.
Obviously, the McLaren with a Mercedes engine as well next year, so it should be very interesting to see if that ends up with giving them any performance gains on the track. So exciting stuff. Obviously, as we said, there'll be a bit more, but there's a few more deep dives into F1 on our sort of feed, if you like. So check those out as well. Let's close out by talking about football. And again, all of you three, I'm sure have plenty to say on this one. And Luke, I mean, I sort of wanted to start with this, and I mentioned this sort of off air, but it's quite remarkable that, with the football season, obviously, if you go back chronologically, obviously kept going until March, and then there was that, obviously, all play kind of came to a stop, and it was remarkable that the and I know people may know that I am a Bundesliga enthusiast, but it is remarkable that they were the first to kind of get themselves back into gear and kind of then sparked sort of what was then to kind of transpire across the continent throughout that period of that, at least of that pandemic, that sort of one of the high points of the pandemic.
Yeah, the Bundesliga was really excellent. I think the quality of football on show was much better than what we saw in other European leagues. I think kind of the end of season in the Bundesliga was more entertaining than what we saw in the Premier League. I think that was more of a kind of shuffling the pack. Anything could happen. I think in the Bundesliga, all of the teams kind of returned, and it was still interesting because they were still playing of a similar standard. The important thing to note about the Bundesliga as well is there was so much going on at both ends of the table. And I mean, I came on quite a lot of your streams over the summer, and I watched a lot of the teams right down the bottom. And even those teams like that eventually did manage to stay up. It was just a case of fighting tooth for now. And you could tell that the players really cared. And you could tell that it was somewhat of a huge summer for German football, because for the first time in a very, very long time, you had everyone watching the Bundesliga. And I think that is the key takeaway from this summer. It was the fact that the Bundesliga, especially in the UK, kind of from our perspective, it really did break through and people were interested. I mean, kind of a case in point of that is the Boar's kind of the sports section's top article of the summer was a match report I wrote from the second division game in Germany. So yeah, it was a great summer for German football, and I'm so glad it paid off, because of course it paved the way for the Premier League to return. We had the Championship return also. So yeah, it was a great summer.
Yeah, and obviously it then led to that successfully, as I said, transferred La Liga, Serie A, all the kind of major football leagues came back, including England. Obviously, unfortunately, League Two, League One kind of ended their seasons as it was, and indeed further down the pyramid as well. But the Championship and the Premier League kept going, and Ben, while it was great, it was kind of great to have it back, wasn't it? And obviously I just wanted to know what your perspective was of when it came back and how you felt when football was coming back. Obviously there was no fans, which it does, and it still has taken something out of the game. And obviously, unfortunately, at the time of recording, obviously with the south of England predominantly going into lockdown, it looks like there won't be many fans at many games. But give us, your perspective on sort of that void that English football had throughout that sort of late spring, early summer period, and then having the Premier League back and the Championship back as well.
Yeah, I think it was massive for the country. I think it was such a big morale boost. I mean, I know, speaking for myself, most of my days were then filled up with just watching the Premier League, and even before that, watching the Bundesliga, because I just wanted to watch football. So I think it was absolutely massive, and I think it was disappointing not to have fans there. But you also saw, you did see some competing, probably bar Liverpool winning, going on. I think Bruno Fernandes, that signing that we properly got to see after Project Restart, I think that was massive in changing the top four dynamic, which obviously allowed Man United to get third, and then also relegation. You lost Bournemouth and Watford, which was kind of from a neutral point of view a bit sad. You see especially with Bournemouth and Eddie Howe, kind of football romantics, seeing that story kind of end. So yeah, I mean, it was really, really interesting to see the Premier League get back, and that paved the way for a very interesting transfer market as well. I mean, you saw there the Jadon Sancho saga, Messi potentially leaving and then didn't in the end, and Chelsea kind of trophy shopping, buying Timo Werner, Ziyech, and all of their recruits. So Yeah, it was really interesting and really odd. Obviously, a bit sour now that as soon as fans are allowed to be back, they're almost not again. So that's a shame. But I think what it really just highlighted the most is that football, and not just football, just sport needs fans, and it's nothing without its fans. It was a fantastic morale boost for people to see it on TV and watch. But I think if anyone's watched the Sunderland documentary, and you really see how much the football means to the fans. It's their life. It's for some of them all they say all they've got. I think that really just summed up how important sport is for everyone. I think that was great, and I think football being probably the most kind of globally recognised sport, and that coming back relatively quickly compared to other sports, I think that was important in really highlighting that and highlighting the need to get fans back in stadiums, but also be grateful that it's on the TV again, because it's such an important thing for so many people. And I'm talking about sport as a whole there, but football in particular for its global recognition. It was an interesting restart, and I think an interesting season in the end. But obviously, shout out to Liverpool for that domination in their first title in 30 years.
Yeah, and obviously it should be mentioned. Obviously, all these football leagues came back. They did not opt for that sort of bubble approach. Obviously, went as normal pretty much, and it's quite remarkable that, with the exception, forgive me, I may be forgetting a few significant COVID cases, but I think overall, in general, it managed to kind of control. It managed to get away hitch-free, with the exception, obviously, of the MLS. They did go opt for that bubble environment and obviously use that one as well. Cam, when I think about which teams prospered on the pitch, two teams come to mind, and the first obviously being Liverpool. This 2020 year has been, obviously unfortunate, as Ben alluded to. Obviously, their fans couldn't celebrate the league title, but on the pitch is what they've just had a really excellent year. Obviously, there's been the odd wobble here or there, but in general, they have had an outstanding 2020.
No, absolutely. I think Liverpool have I think very much obviously from the start of the season, from obviously going into 2019, just the relentless form they were on towards the end of it, and then coming into 2020 and just carrying that on. I do think their form dipped after winning the league. I don't know if it was some sort of hangover almost of kind of being able to take the foot off the gas, or whether that was Jurgen Klopp saying, this is going to be difficult, you can take your foot off the gas for a bit. But Liverpool have been fantastic, and I think this has been 5 years in the making. From the minute Jurgen Klopp walked into Liverpool, he wanted to put his footballing philosophy, that gegenpressing style, very much at the forefront of how Liverpool play. He wanted to import his culture as well into that club, and he lives and breathes Liverpool Football Club, and they live and breathe him. And it's just a relationship that, through also a very clever recruitment as well, the work that Michael Edwards, the sporting director, has done in bringing in the players, not only the players that Jurgen Klopp wants, but the players that Jurgen Klopp needs as well. And we've seen it. Just Liverpool have built a team that is relentless in that style of football. And I think particularly coming into this 2021 season, and we've seen the injuries mount up in that team, one of the things that's really impressed me is not just the depth that they have, but also the youngsters that have come into that team but know the football. They fit almost in immediately. And we've seen it. Curtis Jones has been fantastic, fitting into that side, into that midfield. And, starting ahead of Oxlade-Chamberlain at the weekend. Diego Jota, another player, again, coming from Wolves, but he knew the expectations immediately and really instilled into him. And he's been playing some of the best football of his career. So Liverpool have not just been playing fantastically on the pitch and, getting the wins, but they have a real style about them and a real philosophy that all of those players buy into. And compared to, I'd say, something like a Manchester City at the moment, where they have a style, but it's not coming off at the moment, and where their injury crisis that they've had, per se, with Aguero, has kind of led to them just struggling to play that style. Everyone at Liverpool knows what's expected of them. They know just how to play that well, and you've seen it. Liverpool have been the second best team of 2020. I'm guessing you mentioned two teams beforehand, Josh. I'm guessing the other team is Bayern Munich.
Yes, you like a mind reader. You've perfectly telegraphed what my next sort of point was going to be. And Ben, I was going to turn to you. I mean, as Cam alluded to, the other team that I feel like I've had an outstanding 2020, and it's quite damning that a lot of these other footballing giants in England, in Spain, in Italy have, to me, and maybe I'm wrong here, but I feel like it's been more of a mixed year for them. I would say the two teams I feel like have had very good years were Liverpool and Bayern Munich. And Bayern, obviously, as we alluded to, Bundesliga obviously came back early, but they still had a Champions League campaign to prepare for in August in Lisbon, and they pulled off an excellent season, with obviously Lewandowski being probably the most outstanding player this year in this calendar year as well.
Yeah, no, I think it was incredible. I think the thing to think of with Bayern Munich is just sheer domination. I think they completely deserved the Champions League, and I think they completely, bulldozed every single team in the way of them in doing that. So I think it was an incredible year for them. And interestingly, they improved in the summer. Somehow that team that is amazing to watch has improved in the summer with the acquisition of Leroy Sané for around about 50 million, which is a fantastic deal. So, I think it's incredible. And I think Bayern Munich really deserve it. I think they've built a very strong team. I think Hansi Flick deserves a mention, because I think, he really kind of revitalized, the likes of Jerome Boateng, integrating him back into the side. So I think that, and Thomas Muller as well. So I think that was really, really important from him. And I've never seen, I think, a manager hit the ground running and then just continue that run for as long as they did. And they still look formidable. They play such a high line and such high intensity football, want to win the ball back, want to commit bodies forward, and it really worked, and whilst they're probably the most unconvincing performance was in the Champions League final, yet still, if that's their most unconvincing performance, they still convincingly won it. So yeah, it was a fantastic year for Bayern Munich, and like you said, Bayern Munich and Liverpool really kind of set themselves away from the rest of kind of the global footballing giants, and they both got what they deserved.
Yeah, and sort of the final, and afterwards I'll kind of turn it to you guys and see what kind of footballing stories or teams or players stood out to you over this calendar year. But Luke, the other thing that's kind of, and obviously it does, lo and behold, it takes a disaster to kind of realize this, but the football finances situation. And we've seen, obviously, last year, Bolton and Bury, we saw their struggles. This year, obviously, the pandemic has exacerbated struggles, at least in the Football League. Even clubs like Barcelona are massively in trouble in terms of finances. And obviously, we also had Project Big Picture came about in the summer. That kind of came and went, but it became evident that sort of a better long-term solution was needed in terms of football finances. That seems to have, 2020, we've seen a kind of larger focus on that, haven't we? And the sort of larger scrutiny, and the fact that something needs to change. And even, going back to the start of the pandemic with clubs furloughing employees, and sort of the kind of attention that also brought itself on from non-football fans as well. So, 2020 there's been a larger focus on the way that the sport is structured financially as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the important thing to remember about football as a marketplace, as an economy, is that at some point it will get too big. And I think we have either gone past that point or are definitely approaching it. Because the Neymar transfer a couple of years ago, I think is the clearest example of this. No football player, regardless of how long their contract is, should be worth that amount of money. And it's untenable for this amount of money to continue to be spent. And as you say, we've seen it at all levels of the game. Clubs like Barcelona struggling, and obviously teams like Bury struggling at the same time. There is definitely financial mismanagement at all kind of levels. And it's not just clubs, and I think that's the important thing to remember. The Football Association this year has reduced the award money for the FA Cup. So like the first qualifying round, the prize money was cut in half and this kind of stuff. And the issue that football has is that it can only get so big in its current form. And I think we might have got to the end of this stage of football. So you had kind of the pre-Premier League era, which was very different. Then you had Premier League, and then inevitably something else will come along, something else will change football drastically. And again, back in the 70s, it would have been unimaginable for footballers to be able to kind of leave their clubs on a Bosman ruling. It would have been unimaginable for goalkeepers to not be able to pick a pass kind of played back to them. football always changes and football will continue to change. And I think the question, kind of, you mentioned Project Big Picture. I think the question is a matter of when something comes along and changes football once again, rather than if it will come along and change football once again. And I think that is terrifying for a lot of clubs around the world because they fear about being left out. And I think the biggest concern about Project Big Picture and kind of things like the European Super League is that global football ends up in a situation like American sports where you have big teams with big reputations who control everything, and it's centralized in kind of almost a franchise model. And I think that is the thing that football desperately needs to avoid. It still needs to be promotion, relegation, all this kind of stuff, if it is able to remain viable, because you can't have a situation where the same teams play each other all the time. And I think football will change. It will have to, because the financial side of the game has just got so out of hand. The question is, how do governing bodies do this responsibly? Because if the top six were to leave the Premier League, that would just kill the Premier League off completely, because kind of the biggest teams in the league reputationally would be clubs like Everton and West Ham, and that isn't sustainable given kind of the TV deal. And the final thing I'll say on this is that, kind of as we record, there's been a big case in France where kind of Ligue 1's television deal has kind of fallen through, and it's leaving a lot of teams in France looking for that extra money. And as we enter 2021, I'm sure that's something that we're going to see more of.
Yeah, absolutely. And we see it as well with the constant discussions with broadcasters. And obviously there was a thing earlier in the summer of, was Sky going to pay clubs back with some of the money they bought, broadcasting rights and so on. And it's been an interesting season. And by the way, I should have mentioned at the top, and obviously we saw it recently with the PSG Istanbul game. Obviously social justice and athletes kind of taking it into their own hands as well. It's been a 2020. We've seen an increased focus on that, whether it was players kneeling before their respective game or match or whatever, whether it was, messages underneath their t-shirt. It's been a big year for that as well. So I thought I'd give that a mention. But 2020 in terms of football, I'll kind of now ask everyone to kind of just a story that stood out, whether it's a player signing, whether it's been the emergence of a player success, maybe a regression, who knows. But feel free to fall back on your personal interests as well, be it your favorite club or, Luke, I know obviously the US has had a very good year in terms of football as well. But Ben, 2020 in football, what's, aside from the stuff that we've kind of mentioned, what has sort of stood out to you?
I think it's recent, but it's apparent. I think I'm really, really looking at the revitalization of Jose Mourinho and Spurs. I think it's really interesting. I think it's a match that not all of us originally thought, okay, that's a good idea. That maybe it's not, but I think now we're starting to see something good. I think the Son and Kane partnership, if they carry on the way they are, that's potentially one of the best partnerships the Premier League's ever seen. And I think we're really seeing this different side. I think the documentary allowed that, and now we're seeing him more active on social media as well. And Spurs are kind of they're playing Jose Mourinho's way, and it's working again. And all of this, Jose Mourinho is proving his critics wrong with all of these pundits kind of saying his style's now out of date. It's clearly not. Evidently, it's working, and we'll see for how long it can work. There's a massive kind of psychological block there for Spurs to win trophies, and this is the year where I think they could potentially break that. I think Mourinho is a big enough factor for that. So that's what I'm really interested to see, and I've been really interested to see this year, because I never thought Maurizio Pochettino would be out the Spurs job, and I never thought Jose Mourinho would be in the Spurs job, and it seems to be going a lot better than I first expected.
Yeah, absolutely. The kind of revitalization of Spurs has been certainly a story, and will be a story to watch out in 2021. Cam, any footballing story or kind of transfer signing, player progression, anything stood out to you this year?
I think, from my personal perspective, obviously Portsmouth Football Club, I think losing the end of League One, I think we were on a roll, could have got into one of those top two positions, go up automatically, get into the playoffs, our best chance to get promoted out of League One, compared to the last chance we had. Oxford, Wycombe Wanderers, you should have been able to beat both of those teams. Oxford is our bogey. It's some reason is our bogey team, and we lost. arguably playing a frankly awful second leg that we deserved to lose that game. And so we're stuck in League One. We're third now. It's a similar position to what we were in last year, arguably in a more difficult league to go up with Hull City, Sunderland, Charlton Athletic, Ipswich, all of those teams fighting. So, yeah, as a football club, we need to get out of League One because, as I said, we fell from in administration down to League Two. We are a championship club, in my opinion. So good to get out. And then, I think from a Portsmouth Football Club perspective, perhaps something even more agonising is the success of our closest rival, Southampton. The transformation that they've had under Ralph Hasenhüttl, I think losing 9-0 to Leicester somehow in a sort of perverse and seemingly on the face of it illogical way gave Hasenhüttl even more power and even more influence to bring in the style of football that he wanted, to play the team and set it up in his style, and it's reaping the benefits. Danny Ings scoring nearly about, I think it was about 20 goals. I mean, Danny Ings is not a 20 goals a season striker from what we've seen previously in his career. And the transformation of Danny Ings has been fantastic. James Ward-Prowse as well, I think someone who's really made a claim to be a part of that England midfield now. I think Che Adams, we've seen his form, scored at the weekend. He's been great as well. But just as a whole, it's agonizing, to think almost a year ago that, I was celebrating the fact that Portsmouth could be in the Championship this season with Southampton, being able to, have those South Coast derbies again, and finally just show our neighbours, who really, does the talking on the South Coast. But yeah, it's it's good to watch what Hasenhüttl's done there, but it is equally very frustrating.
On mute. There we go. What I did say was I can only imagine. Repeating myself there. Luke, I turn to you. I guess same question. What has there been a particular story development that stood out to you this year?
The story that stood out to me this year, as you kind of alluded to earlier, was how activism has bled into all sports, but kind of football in particular. And something that I mentioned in an article for The Bore in October was a couple of incidents that the San Diego Loyal had. So this is a team from the second division of American football, American soccer, they're owned and managed by Landon Donovan, who is like the most successful American soccer player in history, basically. And in back-to-back games, the players were targeted with a racial slur and then a homophobic slur. And kind of after the racial slur, the team decided to play on. They played the game, and then afterwards, kind of the points were annulled. In the second game, Colin Martin, who's like one of the only openly gay men in football, was subject to a slur, and the team walked off the pitch, and they didn't return. And of course, we've seen that more recently with Istanbul, Başakşehir, and Paris Saint-Germain too. But why this really stood out to me was the fact that this small, in many respects, inconsequential team from the second division of American football had such a global audience for such a short space of time. And it's because they really did shine the light on issues that were so important, not just to them, but to society as a whole. And I think kind of specifically to Landon Donovan, he dealt with that situation so well. And when you compared it with kind of how the other team's coach dealt with the incidents, there was like land and sea apart. And I think 2020 should be the year where we kind of finally recognize that athletes shouldn't just be told to stick to sports. That's not what they should do. We shouldn't tell people to stay in their lane. And I think it's good that people like Landon Donovan, people like Lewis Hamilton aren't afraid to speak out about things that are really important. So yeah, that San Diego Loyal spell in October is something that definitely caught my eye.
Yeah, it does feel like a sort of sea change. And obviously, I don't get too political, but obviously, athletes had a fair amount to say, obviously, with the election, the US election, and obviously the good work of Marcus Rashford as well. Athletes sort of standing up for the social change that they believe in, and it should obviously be welcomed. They have the free voice too, they have the platform too. It should absolutely be something that continues going forward. Just quickly to wrap this up, 2021, obviously a packed schedule, obviously with things from 2020 being moved to 2021. So packed schedule, something you're looking forward to, and something you're like, let's say a New Year's wish and something as well that you're excited for? It doesn't have to be in football. It can be, or it can be whatever sport you may pick. Ben, I'll start with you first.
My New Year's wish is for my football team, Manchester United, to sack Ole Gunnar Solskjaer and appoint Mauricio Pochettino. I don't think it's going to happen, but that's my wish, and I've said countless times on the Quorum stream why. And I'm really excited for the Euros. I think it's going to be interesting. I hope it goes ahead. So that's sort of a wish as well, but. As of now, I'm really, really excited to see that. I think it's maybe a bit more open this year. Of course, France looks strong, but hopefully, excited to see what happens there and how far England can go.
Cam, same question. Something you're excited for and maybe something you're hoping for to happen as well.
There's a lot I'm excited for. I think on a personal note, obviously, I've already mentioned Portsmouth Football Club. Hope we do go up to the Championship this season, and as well, of course, talk about England earlier. Hopefully, we can win the Ashes, maybe a 5-0 whitewash down under. I'm going to be very difficult indeed, but I would love for the Aussies to stop berating us Poms for a summer. That would be nice. But I am excited for the Olympic Games definitely next year. I think that's going to be. I think it's going to be a really interesting game for Team GB because we've had 2 fantastic Olympic Games in London and Rio, and I don't think many people are expecting us to do as well as we did in those 2 games, but we have some really fantastic athletes coming through who I think can have fantastic games. Obviously, Adam Peaty, someone who's been world beating almost since 2014, winning gold in 2016. It'll be interesting to see if he can convert that form over. Dina Asher-Smith, I'm really excited to see what she can do in Tokyo. I think she is a real prospect for a double 100-meter, 200-meter sprint double, perhaps even a relay gold as well. I think just how excited I am to see what she can do. She's really come on in the last couple of years. And again, we haven't had a sprint gold medalist since Linford Christie. So yeah, I think it's going to be a really exciting games, Tokyo. I think I'm optimistic. I think GB may not do as well as we did in London and Rio, but I would love to hope we can come second in the medal table again.
And Luke, finally, something you're again excited for and something you're personally also hoping for to come out of 2021 sports-wise.
So the thing that I'm excited for this year would be to watch Jesse Marsh's career develop. So he's currently in charge of Red Bull Salzburg. He's one of the best young up-and-coming managers in football, and I think he's destined to either get a job in the Bundesliga imminently or kind of in the not-so-distant future. So that's something that I'm really excited about because he's a tremendous manager, and I think he'll go really far, and I think he'll change the way that kind of American soccer is looked at around the world. My Christmas or New Year's wish, wherever, would be that British ice hockey comes back. There's been a lot of discussions recently about how the Elite Ice Hockey League will return, whether or not it will be able to return, if it can afford to return. It was such a good season last year, and 2019 was such a good year for British ice hockey. The national team stayed up in the top 4 of the World Championship. That is frankly unheard of. I mean, Ben Bounds, who has since moved to a European team, was saving ridiculous shots off of kind of NHL prospects. It was quite unbelievable. So the thing that I'm really excited for, or rather hoping happens, is that the EIHL comes back and I get to report on commentary plays again, because that's something that I've certainly missed since becoming kind of sport editor for the Boar. So yeah, hopefully ice hockey comes home.
Absolutely. And I mean, there's obviously a lot to look forward to, and in 2020 will be looked at, I guess, in a very bipolar way, either the worst year ever, or like it was all right. But certainly, in the face of the pandemic, in the face of such adversity, sort of sport, we managed to get a pretty action-packed year, which is something I didn't think we would be saying in March. But it's been great to look back on it, and obviously hoping for a lot more of this in 2021. So wrapping this up, my thanks to Ben Parkinson, Luke James, and Cam Hall for joining me. And 2021, obviously a lot of sport coming up, and we will continue our content in the new year, bringing you as much as we can. with talk and just being your student radio station, being the voice of just, whatever you want to get your views across in terms of sport and all that stuff. So thank you so much for listening and watching, and we will see you in 2021. So thank you very much.